Let's jump into our keynote speaker. So, a very good friend of mine who is now part of our board for i2i, who I've known for 8 years, Mark Tomaino. If you've seen Mark and Matt stand beside each other, you may take a double take. So obviously they're twins, which you might notice. I don't think Mark can stand up here and do what Matt's going to do for us, even though he might tell you he can. But a couple of things to introduce Matt. We were looking for someone who could really come and speak with you guys about, obviously, transformational care. And Mark came up with this idea, hey, you ought to talk with my brother, Dr. Matt Tomaino. As you guys can see, I'm not going to read off his bio, but Matt's been very focused, obviously, in orthopedic care, specific to shoulder, hand, and elbow. Started his own practice and has been very focused in that area since 2008. What's also interesting is he has an MBA. So at some point he thought it was very important for his career to also add the business element to his practice and to his profession. Something you may not know, which I have learned about Matt, is that he's about to celebrate 28 years with his lovely wife, Amy, who is here, which I think is awesome. His son, while I am in Nashville, I was hoping that we could recruit him to Vanderbilt because that's where he wanted to go. Unfortunately, he didn't make that happen, but that's okay. He's headed to the University of Michigan this coming fall. Go Blue, go Big Blue, yes. We're really excited to have Matt. Let's give a round of applause for him.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Thank you so much for that great introduction and for bringing everybody's attention to the fact that, yes, Mark and I are twins. What you were incorrect on, though, is he could give this talk, and it would be all complete BS, but he could do it. And the other thing that just, without much time to think about it, but as Justin brought your attention to the tree back there and everything, is that if you really concentrate on what it is you do, over time, like anything, what it is that I do, I often think I'm just a piece worker. I just connect things and things like that. It can be somewhat uninspiring, but if you contemplate on why you do it, it has a completely different spin on things and can keep you so engaged in what it is you do. Thank you, Janice, for inviting me to be here. It's such a privilege because I'm talking on a topic that is increasingly important. As I contemplated the theme of this year's meeting, Transforming Outcomes, I thought what an inspiring concept transformation is. And yet in the midst of our daily lives, we often may miss out on opportunities to continue to reinvent ourselves and transform ourselves. And as I read a little bit about population health and i2i software solutions and what's happening in terms of patient engagement and patient-centered medical homes, I thought that while, as i2i says, data is indeed the new currency in healthcare, to truly transform outcomes, there has to be more than data. There has to be collaboration. There has to be teamwork. And we know, and plenty of research substantiates this, that teams and high-performing teams outperform the aggregate of individuals, even talented individuals, all the time. And yet, for some reason, high-performing teams, especially in healthcare, remain very elusive. So I'm going to spend the next 45 or 50 minutes talking a little bit about that issue and share with you my story of transformation from orthopedic surgeon to more collaborative teammate. And I ask for your indulgence because it is my story that I'll share with you, but my purpose in doing that as a prelude, if you will, to talking about teamwork is to hopefully stimulate you all to reflect on why it's important nowadays to develop a keener sense of the power of team and to really think about whether there's opportunity in your own lives and your own jobs to transform yourselves not only into more collaborative teammates, but in whatever way transformation may benefit you. So, let me begin by acknowledging that the silver bullet that we're really talking about is a synergistic team, where the total is truly greater than the sum of the parts. And we have to define team. We're not talking about departments or divisions or huge groups. We're typically talking about working groups of 5 to 10 or whatever. But they're groups that others would see as an intact social entity, and they're groups where there are interdependent tasks, and there's shared responsibility for outcomes. And teamwork requires collaboration, shared goals, and mutual accountability. Mutual accountability. I was in Washington the end of April for a hand meeting, so a bunch of hand surgeons. So as you can imagine, most of the talks were on the technical things of what we do. But I got to thinking about the why of teamwork when we all took a tour of the Capitol and watched an inspirational video that really heralded our nation's history, not only in terms of governance, but in terms of the congressional process. And when they put the seal up there, and I looked on the back of a penny after, I found the e pluribus unum, which means out of many, one, or from many, one. And I thought, boy, when it comes to a high-performing team, this is really what we aspire to. But as we've seen in Congress of late, there's no question that despite a group of people with arguably the same vision and the same commitment, if we can't work together, we have very little chance of accomplishing shared goals. Now, Patrick Lencioni, who wrote The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, underscores that teamwork remains the one sustainable competitive advantage that has largely been untapped. As was mentioned, my son Nick and Amy and I were at the University of Michigan for an admitted students weekend about a month ago. And our tour guide regaled us with stories of their legendary football coach, Bo Schembechler, who is all about team.
We want the Big Ten championship, and we're going to win it as a team. They can throw out all those great backs and great quarterbacks and great defensive players throughout the country and in this conference. But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team. And if we think that way, all of us, everything that you do, you take into consideration what effect does it have on my team. Because you can go into professional football, you can go anywhere you want to play after you leave here. You will never play for a team again. You'll play for a contract, you'll play for this, you'll play for that, you'll play for everything except the team. And think what a great thing it is to be a part of something that is the team. We're going to win it. We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. Better than anybody else in this conference, we're going to play together as a team. We're going to believe in each other. We're not going to criticize each other. We're not going to talk about each other. We're going to encourage each other. And when we play as a team, when the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again. Michigan.
So I love that video, especially the end of it. And it was a little lengthy, and I thought about editing it. But at the end of it, he says, and we're not going to talk about each other, and we're not going to do this. And You know, so often the things that derail us on a team are not our competency and may not even be our ability to work with each other, but it's the difficult things that erode trust, and then our willingness sometimes behind someone's back to talk about them or whatever, rather than addressing conflict together. But what Schembechler did was really build an ethos, a culture that no one was more important than the team. And so segueing back to the e pluribus unum, out of many one, it's really kind of the same message. Well, as Justin mentioned in terms of sort of metrics, and there being a number, we don't talk about outcomes, or clinical outcomes, he said. We talk about outcomes. There can be operational and process and all this. I think it's the same, really, if you were to look and do an audit or a forensic on whether your team's high performing. Really depends on what you measure. If it's merely process compliance, you may have a great team in your eye. If it's merely patient outcomes, same thing. It could be patient satisfaction, which for many physicians nowadays, especially surgeons, they still struggle with the concept that you can do a perfect operation and, as an orthopedic surgeon, get a perfect result and still have a patient who says the experience was lousy and have yourself get criticized for a poor outcome based on satisfaction. But that is the reality we're at. Very infrequently do we actually reflect on whether the team itself is a good team based on whatever it is that defines that. And there are a number of assessment tools. We'll sort of get into it a little bit later. And then lastly, there's organizational satisfaction. But the one thing that's clear, simply hitting quality benchmarks, simply showing process compliance, and there are all sorts of things we all have to do in healthcare nowadays to get paid. Doing those things does not guarantee that your team is a high-performing team. And the problem is that if we don't assess our teams and think about that, then our teams may be underdeveloped and we may leave performance on the table. So getting back to Michigan again, I was at a housing thing where they talked about what our child, what Nicholas can expect, and one of the parents raised their hand and asked about the wall treatments. Maybe they wanted to bring curtains or something, and he said, let me tell you something. Picture a rectangle. A very small rectangle that maybe you think you could live in, and we put 2 or 3 in. That's the room. And he said, your kids are going to really learn how to be good roommates. And he asked the parents in the crowd, so there were about 500 kids, so roughly 750 to 1,000 parents, how many had grown up sharing a room with a sibling? And how many do you think raised their hand? Everyone. Back then, you always had a brother or sister, unless you were, okay, everyone raised their hand. And then who said none? Janice. And then he said to the kids, okay, how many of you have shared a room? 500 kids. How many do you think raised their hand? Okay. 2 people raised their hand, and when he asked, they were identical twins. Now, I can tell you, Mark and I used to say to people in jest, we were womb mates. And we were womb mates, and we were roommates, but even that didn't guarantee that he and I didn't have roommate problems in college, because it's a different thing. You have to actually, just like on a new team, build trust, establish these things. Just because you're there and you both got into the school and you both have probably similar values doesn't necessarily mean you'll be good roommates. So I got to thinking, you know, although my parents, Nicholas's grandparents, would say he's going to have a real tough time in college having a roommate. He's never had a roommate. And parenthetically, I think, what's your point? He's an only child. Of course he hasn't had a roommate. But I think, you know, he's going to learn to be a good roommate, but it's going to take some time. And thinking about people who have worked for years, surgeons in particular, because again, this is sort of my story, with the prevailing concept of team as the individuals who support my task. My team is there to support my task. Anybody that thinks of team that way may have some difficulty truly shifting mindset or appreciating what true collaboration is. I don't think that's surprising. So I want to tell you a little bit about how I started my career, just to give you some context for my remarks. I took a job at the University of Pittsburgh as an assistant professor in 1994, and that followed 4 years of medical school at the University of Rochester. And somebody mentioned to me that there's somebody in the audience who went to the University of Rochester for med school. Is that true? Great. What year did you graduate? 98. Wow, that's great. Congratulations. I graduated in, Amy, what year did I graduate? 86. 86, long time ago. And then I did 2 years of general surgery. I thought I wanted to be a cardiac surgeon. I had that personality type. Changed my mind and went into orthopedics. So I did 2 years of general surgery, 4 years of orthopedic surgery, a year of hand surgery where I learned shoulder and elbow. And then I think bringing back to my passion for vascular and cardiac surgery, I did a year of reconstructive microsurgery, 6 months, I should say, at Toronto, and then I went to the University of Pittsburgh, as depicted here. And, during my training, as I think back to it compared to today, there were no work hour limitations. When you got 4 weeks vacation, and the 1 week that you'd get off for vacation, the next 3 weeks you were literally on call every other night, which meant being in the hospital. It was you built an internal fortitude, but you also built, I think, with that resilience, a certain focus to be all about doing your job. And in fact, social capital, training in surgery back in the 80s didn't matter much. It was really about doing your job. We may have talked about our weekends with our fellow residents. And in orthopedics at the time, it was all guys. We didn't have a woman in our year, which would have been a good influence, I think. But we didn't talk about our weekends with our attendings, if you will. It didn't matter. They just expected you to do your job. And while in Pittsburgh for 9 years, I further developed my surgical expertise. And the paradigm at the time, frankly, was that the team was there to support the successful execution or performance of the surgeon's craft. So, kind of to use a car analogy, I became a very skilled driver, my hands on the wheel as a surgeon, and my team was all in. I wrote a lot of papers. I received some research grants, I think 1 or 2 NIH grants. I thought I wanted to have a career in academic medicine. I was invited to join the editorial board of the Journal of Hand Surgery. I'm no longer on that, but I am on the editorial board of the Journal of Shoulder and Elbow Surgery. And when you read these things, it's all about task. It's not about behavior. It's not about outcomes from the standpoint of patient satisfaction so much. It's about outcomes from the standpoint of the orthopedic surgeon looking at what they provided and whether they can demonstrate that the operation worked. And as Justin said, I got my MBA. I thought that indeed to be able to manage the increasing relevance of business metrics in medicine, I should understand the terms. But the point is expertise was my currency. So we talk about data being the currency now in healthcare. Expertise was certainly my currency, and in that regard, to ensure reliable outcomes, variance was my enemy. I remember this case when I was at Pitt. This child was 5 years old. You can see he's missing his thumb, index, and long finger. But just there's a little bit of the base of his metacarpal bone growing up through a skin graft. While I had been a fellow, one sunny, beautiful August day, at 2 p.m., we went into the operating room because this little 4-year-old at the time went to grab a piece of 2x4. His dad was using a circular saw to make a sandbox. And so the piece dropped in little Gayton, went and grabbed it, and sharp cut. And my attending, and I was the fellow, went into the operating room at 2 p.m., and we left the operating room at 2 a.m. We didn't take one break. We reconnected several arteries and veins and everything, and it was just a great, great feeling. Problem is that about a night and a half later, when he started to develop some purple discoloration, the intern on call wrote a note that said bruising, as opposed to concern about the vein being clotted, which causes venous congestion and then the purplish hue. And by the next morning when I went in and saw this, the entire replanted half of hand had died. So it was horrible. We took the patient, the child, to the operating room, skin grafted. And I remember saying to his parents, don't worry, this is going to be okay. First of all, he's 4. He doesn't know any different. He's going to be fine. And second of all, I'm going to Toronto in 2 months, and I'm going to actually become really skilled at attaching toes to hands and all that. So they really trusted me, and indeed they came to Pittsburgh with this problem. And we actually moved his great toe after an initial groin flap to bring more skin in, and he's now, well, that was in 1995, so you can figure out how old he is. He had no problems as a teenager playing soccer without a great toe, and he certainly has been very functional. But as I think back to that case, the stakes were pretty big. And I thought, boy, this is all on me. My team was great, but I never really thought much about what it took to have a great team. I certainly didn't build it. It's kind of like it was just there at Pittsburgh. So over the next several years, the paradigm shift has really changed because it is thought that errors in medicine are often related to power imbalance, and in that regard, hierarchy has become a 4-letter word. And a captain of the ship mentality that most surgeons would understandably, naturally feel is no longer really successful or liked because it can disempower. And again, it is something that may interfere with somebody who has no power, like the person cleaning in the corner of the room, to stop the process or to say, hey, what's going on with that IV disconnected or whatever. And so along with this paradigm shift, influence as a leader on a team, as the physician, as the surgeon, is no longer necessarily predicated simply on your expertise or your title or your authority. You know, and I might add that even though we continue to be the quarterback of the team as the surgeon, because fundamentally it's our hand on the scalpel, it's just not a leadership style that many hospitals like now, because you're dealing with very diverse teams. And many people on the team now don't even have a understanding or an appreciation of how it is that a surgeon may view their expertise as their legitimate basis for leadership. So in September 2002, I was recruited back to Rochester, and Amy and I thought we'd never go back home, because you sort of say colloquially, you're never going to go back to where you trained. But we did it for a few reasons. Number one, both sets of our parents were still alive. With an only child, we wanted Nick to know his cousins. And so we did that, and it was great. I headed the Department of Hand Surgery. I headed the fellowship. I continued to do challenging cases. I felt inspired to challenge the status quo and to introduce some different metrics at times, having gotten my MBA just before I'd come back to Rochester. You know, I liked being regarded as an authority in my professional circles as an orthopedic surgeon. The people on the podium giving talks are respected authorities, and I admired them. In the operating room, I prided myself on my preparation and decisiveness. I was always prepared, and I held not only myself, but my team to a very high standard on behalf of the patient. And I really realized that I deplored mediocrity, and when I felt that something might interfere with the best outcome for my patient, I felt it was my duty to be fairly uncompromising. When I was certain of the right course, I'd voice my opinion without necessarily worrying too much about what others thought of me or whether I was misperceived, and that even included people on my team. I just felt like I know the right course, this is my patient. And I didn't have any negative intent doing that, but it was probably, in retrospect, driven by a feeling that as the surgeon that the patient visited, that entrusted me to have them put to sleep and do their operation, that being resolute was critical, that not being authoritative or resolute was indecisive. At least that's how my mindset was at the time. So kind of in summary, when I was at the wheel with my surgeon frame of mind, I had a firm grip, knew where I was headed, and expected my team, as they had been in Pittsburgh, to be all in. Problem is what I found in Rochester in the early 2000s, after having come back to where I trained, the culture was a bit different. And I felt less unconditional support from my team at times. And I found it disconcerting, to say the least. I found it sometimes annoying, and I didn't really know how to handle it, so I'm sure it was frustrating. In October of 2006, 4 years after returning to Rochester, doing great things, I hit a little bump in the road. And this is by no means unusual in medicine, but it certainly was unusual for me. I went to the pre-op area. I talked to a lady about her right hand, because we had contemplated a carpal tunnel release and were waiting for insurance approval from workers' comp. But on that particular day, we were operating on the left hand, and I planned to do 2 trigger finger releases and a tendon release here. So we went in, this was the last case of the day, my resident sat across from me, and we proceeded to do 2 trigger releases and a carpal tunnel release instead of a de Quervain's release. And there was no timeout. Timeouts are surgical pauses now that are institutionalized. They have been for years, but in 2006 at this surgery center that I was working at, which was a private surgery center, it still hadn't been part of the process mandate. And when I went to the recovery room and I said, your carpal tunnel was tight and your triggers went well, she said, well, doctor, what about the area on the outside, the tendon release? And I, sort of like what I felt when I initially got up here to start my talk, I was winded like I had been kneed in the solar plexus, and I was like, oh my God, Rebecca, I did a carpal tunnel release, not the de Quervain's release. I must have been confused. We were talking about your other hand. I'm so sorry. And she said, oh, she was amazing. That's okay. That's okay. Was my carpal tunnel tight? I said it was tight, and it's going to be fine, and we'll go back and do the de Quervain's at another time. I immediately went back to the operating room, talked to the nurse, and we had a great conversation. We said, I just did the wrong operation. Not on the wrong hand, but this is very, very common in hand surgery, and it was just so devastating to me. And we agreed that we needed to institutionalize timeout procedures. And then I went into the office of the head nurse and the administrator, and they really consoled me and said, this is our error, this is the team's error, and we can't let it happen again. The problem was I was the most accountable. Even though my resident obviously was also asleep at the wheel. I mean, have you ever driven through a red light, and you're like, holy mackerel, I just went through a red light. God, it's a good thing no one was coming the other way, because I wouldn't have had a leg to stand on. I violated but it was my mistake. So about a month later, when it circled back to the university, because I was at a private center, although I was employed, I was really on the hot seat. Unfortunately, when it became very, very clear that I disclosed the error and that kind of thing, it was dismissed with a system error type of thing and a process improvement, which is the way it should be in medicine. That's the way we learn. But the problem is nowadays in medicine, there still isn't what is called a just culture. There's usually too often blame as opposed to coaching. It's very, very at the end of the stage where there's really bad intent that punishment occurs. At any rate, I did leave the university in 2008 to assemble my own team. I felt judged after that, like this mistake was all on me, and although I was accountable for it, it certainly wasn't evidence of a lack of preparation or a lack of intent to do well. It was a human error. And I assembled my own team and felt very much in control of my own team. Amy kindly left her job as a nurse practitioner in cardiac surgery and said, I'll do whatever you want to help start this whole practice. And she really, from the ground up, built the systems, and we got the EMR and did digital x-ray and everything. And I felt very much in control of my new circle of influence and of my new team. Let me say as an aside, if you're wondering what a high-performing team looks like, I would say that a successful marriage, as you heard for 28 years nearly, is perhaps the perfect model of a high-performing team. I mean, if you don't think there are bumps in the road with a 28-year-old marriage with a kid and all this other stuff, you know, you haven't been married. But Amy and I are so effective at working together. We work together. She's my nurse practitioner. She goes to surgery with me and at home because we've cultivated what are key components to high-performing teams: mutual respect and affection that we build on daily. Anyway, I marketed my practice. I used that MBA and my interest in marketing to assemble a brand that was all about the patient. Patients got my email. They were and are the center of the universe. And I became very busy, and in fact, for my area, shoulder, hand, and elbow, I started to substantially compete with my old department, which didn't make them very happy. At any rate, I did about 90% of my work at a private surgery center. This is different from where my carpal tunnel mishap had occurred. And I had been working at Linden Oaks for 6 years, and I became affiliated with Rochester General Hospital for inpatient cases, where I did mostly shoulder replacements. So every other Thursday, I would do 4 shoulder replacements and maybe a couple rotator cuff repairs on people that were too sick to be done as an outpatient. And unlike at the surgery center, where I had built a great team over the years, I rarely got the same group of individuals or team at the hospital, and I never felt much love there. And just as I expressed some annoyance when at the university, where I didn't feel unconditional support for my task, I felt the same way every other Thursday. But I felt that my competence and my expertise should be the basis for trust and support. And when it didn't happen, I just sort of ignored the imperfections in the room. I kept my eye focused on the destination with my hands on the wheel. And I didn't really worry about it. At any rate, after my first year there at this little community hospital, I won't say this little man who was chief of orthopedics, but he was kind of on the short side, met me in the hall once. As I'm going to the operating room, mind you, I'm literally on that floor every other week, one day. I'm not in the cafeteria or anything. And he's walking with me. I heard you were really rough on the nurses last week. And I said something like, you mean 2 weeks ago? I'm only here every other week. Yeah, I want you to not do that anymore, because I'd hate for it to make its way to the 5th floor, which is where the administrators and I live. And I thought, why not? I'd be happy to take it up to the 5th floor and talk about it. You know, I didn't delve into it, you know, like I did say, well, what are you talking about? And he said, just don't let it happen again. And I never pursued it after that, nor did he. At any rate, I felt like being viewed as demanding was evidence of my being perfectionistic, if that's a word, all about the patient. And I sort of dismissed his criticism because I thought he probably heard this from somebody in the room who maybe had their feathers ruffled when we went through 4 arthroscopes to get one that wasn't cracked, something like that. It was always all about the patient. But I would say that nowadays in medicine, there is a very fine line culturally as a physician between being rigid and being demanding and being regarded as disruptive. And disruptive is a horrible term that denotes a lot of bad behavior. But you don't have to have really bad behavior nowadays if you don't fit in culturally the way people expect you to fit in. At any rate, 2 years into my practice in 2010, you can see Amy answering the phone there. That gentleman was visiting me from India for a 6-month fellowship. Things were going great. And then in the summer of 2010, I opened up a letter one day from the Department of Health that said, your practice is being investigated, and please call so-and-so. And I was like, what the heck is that about? And turns out that a drug-seeking patient who saw me once and wanted my PA to give her morphine left the office complaining that she was really going to screw us because we didn't give her morphine. And she called the Department of Health. Now, the Department of Health is obligated to investigate when they get a complaint. And a lot of times what they'll do is they'll just press a button and see if there are any state reportable incidents. And if there aren't, they just leave it alone. But the unfortunate thing for me is the carpal tunnel mishap that I described had generated a state report because it was a seminal event. And they, in reference to that, actually made the allegation to me that I had tried to conceal the error. Even though I had disclosed it, we had affidavits from the administrator and the nurse, they said that my operative note did not clearly state that I messed up and did a carpal tunnel. And they were right. My operative note was imperfect. And I don't really have an explanation except to say that at the time, I think I was probably in such shock that how can I make that mistake? I did a carpal tunnel instead of a such and such, but it didn't occur to me that I should say, this is a mistake. At any rate, I thought it would completely get dismissed when they considered who I was, what my accomplishments had been, how many patients I had helped, what my reputation was. And certainly I had no nefarious intention in the documentation. How many doctors have imperfect documentation? Well, they also referenced a second incident, which I wasn't aware of, and that was an incident that happened in 2009, so 3 years after the carpal tunnel thing, where there was a state report that I had closed a wound with a sponge in the wound. I was like, what can that be? And it turns out that on this particular day, I had 4 total shoulders. And while I'm closing the subcutaneous tissue, which is the last step before putting staples in the skin, one of the nurses said, Matt, the sponge count is incorrect. And I was like, you're kidding. And I asked my 2 assistants, do you remember us putting a sponge in? You know, with a total shoulder, sometimes you do that. But none of us remembered, and I looked, I didn't see it. And I said, okay, call for an x-ray. And they said, it's going to be 20 minutes. I said, oh, that's okay. I'm going to keep closing because I don't want this wound open for 20 minutes. I don't think the sponge is in there. Hey, guys, by the way, next time, let me know that you haven't done the sponge count before I get to the 11th hour because, you know, this should be done earlier. Or maybe I need to let you know that we're closing so it's done. But it was my focus on efficiency. And I think I probably said it just like that. At any rate, the story doesn't end there. When the Department of Health investigated that, now a year and a half later, because the whole allegation started in 2010, they went back to 2009, they visited the nurse in the room that day who didn't say, oh my gosh, this unbelievable surgeon did this great reverse shoulder arthroplasty on this lady who on the left couldn't raise her arm because of a long chronic large rotator cuff tear. And now she can. And they didn't hear about an efficient, really talented, value-driven surgeon. They actually heard about a demanding, arrogant, impatient one. That was their perception. I'd always liked this quotation from George Bernard Shaw. The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress relies on the unreasonable man. To me, it captured the essence of challenging the status quo when necessary and never settling. Being disruptive in this context was a positive term that was inspiring to me. But now it had been a different type of thing. I've been viewed in a very negative and unattractive light. And believe it or not, based on these 2 events in November of 2011, I received a disciplinary sanction. I felt as though my plane had crashed and I was sipping out of a straw. How could this happen to me? I was the same person that I'd been my entire career, same expertise, same knowledge, same commitment, same focus, same values. How could this happen to me? I felt ashamed, I felt punished, and I felt incredibly judged. So, thankfully that's behind me. But it was truly my Stockdale Paradox. Now, Admiral Stockdale was a senior Navy commander who was captured during the Vietnam War and was imprisoned for 8 years. And years after his release, Jim Collins, who wrote the business book Good to Great, coined the term Stockdale Paradox to describe what Stockdale himself had credited getting through the ordeal to. It was his faith that he would prevail, and more importantly, his discipline to confront the brutal facts of his current reality. And I found Stockdale's story very captivating, following my humbling errors, because they had been a real disorienting dilemma. The first stage of 10 stages of transformative learning, going through a divorce, dealing with a chronic illness. For me, my sanction is to live through a challenge that causes you to refocus the way you think and maybe think differently. In Good to Great, Jim Collins argues that this inflection point, this crucible, is something that many level 5 leaders experience not just once in their career, but several times. And I realized that in thinking about it, that I really wasn't an expert at seeing the landscape around me when I was focused on conditions, and I wasn't an expert when my team was not comprised of people that measured up to my expectations, nor did I know how to build team in that context. What I've come to appreciate is that my anxiety or discomfort with being vulnerable was probably at the nexus of the annoyance with things possibly not going well. So my son played #1 on his tennis team this year, and he lost a match recently that he clearly should have won. He had better strokes, clearly was more athletic. Of course, I was a biased dad, but I go to every one of his tennis practices, and the problem was in high school tennis, there's not a referee, so you call your own out points. And the other kid had some really strategic missed calls that Nick thought reflected cheating, and my son started to get really irritated, overhit his second serves, had some double faults, a lot of unforced errors, and lost. And when he came home, he just shook his head, and he said, Dad, I know I kind of lost my cool, but I can't stand it when people cheat. And I said, dude, you didn't lose because he was cheating. You lost because you didn't manage yourself effectively. And I said, what you need to understand is if you were a cross-country runner or on a baseball team, you might really never understand that chink, because you can work on that. So in that regard, losing today was a gift. And I said, it took me 18 years to appreciate my chinks. Or I should say chink, I only think there's one. But just kidding. Dealing with a really difficult team member or situation, we've all been in them, or family incident with a sibling, or when things are not ideal, can bring out the worst in you. If you have insufficient non-technical skills, non-technical in the context of a surgeon who's always thinking about technical, like communication or conflict resolution. And it's something that takes some work. Now, if you feel as though your team is high functioning, it may simply be because of history, long-standing social capital, genuine affection. But if you don't, it's no longer as simple as Jim Collins recommended in Good to Great, which is get the right people on the bus, in the right seats, and the wrong people off. Sometimes we can't do that. Or sometimes we can do that, but it's at a tremendous expense to the company, because the human asset is a very expensive asset to just say, you're not doing a good job, out of here. You really need to have the ability to work and build team. So after my 2011 sanction, I ended up getting a call from a former patient who I'd done a shoulder surgery on, and she said, hey, you want to have a cup of coffee? And she was talking to me about how things were going at the hospital, and I shared with her this sort of things like, not great, team isn't very good, there's a lot of sort of irreverent personalities, I don't feel a lot of love there, sometimes the instruments aren't very good. And she said, well, what needs to change there for things to be better? And that's what I told her. And she said, Matt, I love you, but you've got this orthopedic stuff nailed, but you need a lot of work. And that was really where she and I started what I like to call my journey from i2i. She emphasized what many of you probably know, but I didn't really appreciate it, even with an MBA, that leadership is a process of influencing people. It's not a position. Therefore, anybody can engage in leadership. And although my expertise may have been the ticket onto the team, it wasn't enough. It certainly wasn't currency for leadership. And she described sort of these three circles. The most visible in red is our expertise, our competency. And when you think about what you do, it's what you do. But the less visible are the motivators, your identity as a leader, and your self-regulation. and the inner is a lifelong process of leadership development. Having the appropriate balance between these three domains, Janet says, is your inside-out capacity, your ability to develop from the inside out, not based on how someone else is treating you or what the circumstances are. It's all on you. I now realize that during the first 18 years of my career, I had been in the grip of expertise, task focus, invested in continuing to improve my technical skill, the so-called burden of my craft as a surgeon, and expertise was my currency, but my view of leadership was very narrow. Now, Patrick Lencioni, in the book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, extols the importance of trust as the foundation for them being able to deal with conflict effectively. If you don't deal with conflict, there's lack of commitment. If there's lack of commitment, there's lack of accountability and ultimately inattention to results. But it all starts with building trust. And building trust fundamentally requires self-awareness, a confidence that you're aware of what you're feeling. And the second is self-leadership. So you may feel this way, but your behaviors are effectively managed so that your team doesn't have a misperception. You know, we judge ourselves based on our intent, but others judge ourselves based on our behavior. And those 4 pillars, self-awareness, self-leadership, social awareness or empathy, and relationship management, are what Goleman has called emotional intelligence. And nothing erodes trust more than a disconnect between intention and impact. So if I'm attentive to detail, but I'm perceived as demanding, I erode the trust account. If I have an aversion to variance because I want reliability, but I'm viewed as inflexible, I may debit the trust account. If I'm focused but viewed as self-absorbed, I may debit the trust account. Now, I'm running a little low on time, so I don't think I'll play this video, but I want to tell you that this particular dental hygienist, who's a patient of mine, described her team as a high-performing team because they deliver great care. But in talking to her, it was very clear that the dentist was the boss and never got involved in conflict, that nobody liked each other, there wasn't esprit de corps, and it became very clear to me that there was a sort of a lack of self-awareness, i.e., how can you regard yourselves as a high-performing team simply because you're doing good quality work? And it's a question we all need to think about, because to truly have a high-performing team, it's more than just competency and outcomes, which we'll get into. So building EQ is really important, not only as individuals, but on teams, and Goleman makes this point. My first transformation in developing into a more collaborative leader was to become more aware of the conditions around me, to have a sense of what others in the room are thinking and doing, and being more aware of feelings and not dismissing a sense about me that I knew was inaccurate. Being more invested in narrating my intention to prevent any kind of disconnect between impact and intention. And consequently, I visibly became more interested in the operating room and building relationships, whereas historically, I thought, why should I have to build a relationship? Why doesn't everybody just do their job? But the fact of the matter is the research shows that is a disaster if you think everybody's going to just do their job and you don't have to have relationships. The second was becoming a more agile leader. And Joseph and Joyner in their book talk about the expert leader, which clearly that was my identity as a leader. Autocratic, thought I should be respected based on authority, reluctant to ask for feedback. And the catalyst style is much more empowering, accommodative, aware of biases, and really interested in diverse feedback. And the third clearly was, in a nutshell, slowing down and becoming more mindful. And from what I understand now, with the increasing prevalence of burnout among physicians in particular, a lack of mindfulness is really a root cause. You need to be present in the moment, expressing a curiosity about things. Gee, I wonder why so-and-so is being so difficult today. I wonder what's going on. Maybe I'm going to ask, and then you ferret it out. Michael West from Lancaster University talks in his book Effective Teamwork about team competency, but he also talks about team wellness, which is what I've really been sort of intimating. It's more than competency. You have to have a favorable social climate on a team, and conflict resolution has to be used as a vehicle for growth and learning. If you don't lean into conflict on a team, including bad teams, you miss the opportunity for team development. He's also suggested that with task success, the quality of the experience absolutely requires human connection. And in the absence of human connection, we can continue to do our tasks effectively. We can continue to arguably hit quality benchmarks. But the quality of the experience, how we're engaged, may go down. And it's this very absence of human connection which totally threatens not only our teams, but our doctor-patient relationship nowadays. We're often at the computer doing our records with our back to the patient. We're so stressed by getting the documentation and the note done that we fail to engage the patient. So we have to be very mindful of that. Peter Senge in The Fifth Discipline, which is about systems thinking, talks and differentiates between dialogue and discussion. Dialogue is free-flowing. It's not about winning. It's about understanding. And Crucial Conversation stresses that when you engage somebody to resolve conflict or to inquire about conflict, you contribute to the so-called pool of meaning. So if I had a scrub tech once who said, I don't want to do that, and I said, well, if you don't want to do that, why don't you find somebody who does? Theoretically, if I said that. I might say now, well, why do you feel that way? Huh, okay, what's going on? And in the process, I would build trust. I would probably understand what's going on. It probably has nothing to do with me. But it requires tremendous self-awareness and self-regulation. West calls this team reflexivity, deliberate and regular reflection on objectives, processes, and resources. But he says not just the success of task, not just task reflexivity, but the social reflexivity, really auditing the process of team performance. And so highly performing teams have leaders that vigilantly monitor the dashboard, just like we wouldn't ignore a red light on the dashboard. If you sense there's something going on in a day or a week or whatever, as a leader, and remember, anybody can engage in the process of influence, you really need to lean into it because the emotional reality of the team, the social climate is critical. So, in summary, I changed my mindset as a leader and my identity as a leader. I prioritize not just my focus on what I'm doing, although that remains very important, but I really now recognize that relationships are key and the social climate is key. And I'm interested in people not just for the task. So if the anesthesiologist is in charge of putting the patient to sleep, it's absolutely important to me to understand what they did on their weekend and how their kids are doing. And I'm sorry your grandmother's sick. I cultivate an interest, legitimate interest, in what drives behavior, as opposed to me being sabotaged by a reaction to somebody being a jerk. I now, with that childlike mind, say, that's interesting. I wonder what's going on. And I express personal vulnerability, not only in the context of potentially apologizing during a case where things just don't go well, because after all, I'm a human being, but I'll say I'm sorry. That was a stressful case. I kind of lost a little bit and part friends. But I also narrate my own anxiety more effectively because I don't have to appear to be just invincible. I can say, for example, before this talk, I was a little nervous. So, to wrap it up, today as a surgeon, as your surgeon, potentially, my hands are still on the wheel. You want my hands on the wheel. Although increasingly there's robots and stuff, but I don't think I'd want to visit a surgeon for whom they rely on the robot. It's kind of like I want a pilot who can actually fly the plane if he has to. But I'm a more skilled driver, and I have better vision. I drive more slowly around tight turns, and my teammates are not in the back seat. Developing my inside-out capacity has made me a more collaborative team member, a better physician, and clearly a better leader on a team. I began the talk by saying that I thought transformation was a very inspiring concept. And I hope that my journey inspires you to prevail if you're on your own special journey of transformation, or stimulates you to think about starting one if it's relevant in your life. 4 years ago, when Janet asked me what needed to change in the OR, what I should have said and what I would say now is, me. I need to change. Like Admiral Stockdale said to Jim Collins long after surviving his ordeal, as painful as it was, I would not trade this journey. Thank you for your attention.